A very warm welcome to all of you. We are very fortunate to have with us here today Dr. Chandni Singh, who is going to be talking about climate change and migration. Dr. Singh is the lead practice at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, Bangalore. She's worked on the issue of climate change, adaptation, disaster and risk recovery, livelihood transitions, and rural-urban migration. Her work is quite seminal. It's been funded by a wide range of national and international organizations. Chandni is the lead author of IPCC's Assessment Report 6 in 2022 on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and a contributing author of IPCC's 2018 Special Report on 1.5 degrees. Chandni serves on the editorial boards of Regional Environmental Change, Climate and Development, and IIHS's in-house journal, Urbanization. Thank you so much, Chandni, for making the time for us today, and over to you.
Hello, my name is Chandni Singh. I'm based at the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore. Today I'll be talking about the phenomenon of migration, but in the context of another complex phenomenon of climate change. The way I've planned this session is I'll be talking about two things. One is speaking about climate change, how it's impacting India, what kinds of risks we are seeing because of climate change, and how do we reduce those risks. The second part of the session is going to talk about migration in the context of climate change. What are we seeing globally? What are the studies showing us? And then some more detail on local realities of this. So to start off, climate change, of course, is the idea that human beings have made changes in the way we live, the way we work, the way we travel, the way we eat, to change the system we are living in. And climate change is really a human-induced change that we are seeing, where the globe as a whole is warming. This picture of this book, Assessment of Climate Change over the Indian Region, is a very nice open access summary of the latest science on climate change in India. What are the impacts? What are the kinds of shifts we are seeing? And broadly, and this was written by the Government of India's Ministry of Earth Sciences. What this book is really showing us is, first of all, over the last century, so if we look from 1900s onwards, we are seeing that the Indian landmass has warmed, and average warming is 0.7 degrees Celsius higher than it was a century ago. This might seem like a very small number, but as I'll show you later, it has very, very significant repercussions on agriculture, water availability, how people are able to really live and work. Second thing that the book really tells us is that we are going to be seeing extreme weather events, so things like droughts, floods, extreme heat waves, cyclones, flooding in certain places. And not only are we going to see more of these, which is frequency, but the intensity of this is also going to increase. So more severe floods, longer droughts, hotter heat waves. The book also looks into the future to show us that by 2100, India is actually going to, if we don't do anything, we, both in India as well as globally, if we don't make any changes in the way we are emitting greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to see a warming of 4.4 degrees Celsius. Again, these numbers may not mean anything to you, but if you think about the present moment, currently the world has seen a warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius from the beginning of the century, from the early 1900s. And anyone who's living in India today already knows that there is not a day where we don't see some kind of flood or landslide or drought happening in different parts of the country. So at 1.5 degrees warming, if this is the kind of landscape of extreme events we are seeing, you can only imagine how catastrophic 4.4 degrees warming is. But this is, of course, in brackets you see RCP 8.5, just think of it as the most catastrophic kind of scenario. The worst we can do is this. And of course, the world is doing much better, but as you might know, not enough on climate action. And then coming to India, what is also important to recognize that it's not only about things are going to come faster or they're going to be worse, but also things are coming together. This idea of different hazards coming together is the idea of compounding hazards. In the city that I am sitting in right now, Bangalore, we have these cycles of water crisis, water scarcity, as well as floods happening in the same year. This is something that climate scientists have been predicting for a long time. We call it a compounding of hazards, 2 or 3 hazards coming together. Another example of compounding hazards is when you've got something like a climatic thing, like Cyclone Amphan that happened and hit the Bay of Bengal side, as well as COVID crisis. These 2 things coming together meant that when people were evacuated for Cyclone Amphan, they were put into shelters, but those shelters were undoing some of the COVID protocols of distancing and so on. So this is called a compounding of hazards. And the other big thing that we are already seeing, that we'll continue to see under climate change, is a cascading of impacts. So what happens in one place doesn't stay in one place, because our economic systems are so connected that you will see a cascade. So a drought in a rural area cascading into food insecurity in urban areas. These are some of the things that have been projected, but we are already seeing in India. So this is really the context of climate change in our country. We had recently done some work, and this is again an open access report, where we summarized some of the key risks that are playing out in India, both in the past and are going to happen in the future. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but all I want to say is that the country is definitely already become hotter, but going to become even more hot. And a lot of this heat is going to be concentrated in our cities. The country is also going to become drier, where there are going to be longer and more severe droughts. There are lots of projections that show that India is going to see a larger number of more severe floods. And again, these are concentrated in certain parts of the country. There are projections of sea level rise. So that is when ice at the Antarctic pole melts and causes sea levels to rise. This is particularly alarming for our coastal settlements and cities. And then finally, if one is to think of a counterfactual, even if climate change wasn't there, India as a country is facing various development deficits. So even without climate change, we do have people who face the risk of hunger, who face the risk of water scarcity. And I mention this because it's important for people to understand that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It overlays on existing issues to create this even more severe reality of risk. So we've got that story in that context of climate change. The second big story, I think, that India is going through, there are several other transitions that are characteristic of India's development story. Of course, we are one of the fastest growing economies with a lot of ambition to become an advanced economy by mid-century. But there are other realities of India's development transition. Women are less employed than men, and there are various statistics around this. This is one of them. We also know that there is tremendous change happening in rural areas. This is not new, but has been ongoing. Conversations around agrarian distress, people not wanting to stay in farming, children of farmers not wanting to continue as farmers. So this whole idea of an aspirational change in rural areas, where people are increasingly looking to non-farm sectors to pick up jobs, earn a living. And of course, a very big central characteristic of the Indian economy is that it is predominantly informal, which means that people don't have formal agreements of work, they don't have the safety nets that formal work provides, and somewhere they fall between the cracks at times. I'm not saying that informal work is bad, because it gives a lot of flexibility to various people across the country. But what it means is that the kinds of protection that are available to formal workers are not there in the informal economy. Also, of course, India is urbanizing, not as rapidly as one would expect it to, but almost half our population will be living in cities by 2035. So this whole idea, and by some estimates, people say that already urban residents are very high in India, but are deeply undercounted. And what this means is that that common adage that we had of India lives in her villages is changing. And so the kinds of strategies we need to think about also needs to change in some ways. And of course, central to, I'm sure, this audience is the story of India's on the move. India has always been on the move in some ways, and we have a large migrant population. Of course, these numbers are from the 2011 census, which is deeply undercounting and is deeply outdated. And there are other, of course, estimates that show that migration is an ongoing phenomenon. It has always been there, it will always continue. And I give this story of this development transition to put the climate transition as one part of this larger development transition that is happening. When you put these two stories together, it is only natural that we have to understand what is happening at the intersection of climate change and the intersection of this changing nature of labor in our country. And this is where the story of climate change and migration come together. I'll be drawing on a lot of work that I'm doing from a project that's called Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways, which is a project where we're working in Orissa, Karnataka, and Kerala to understand climate-induced or climate-augmented migration in these three states and between these three states. So as I said, of course, migration is something that has been happening, and with or without climate change, it would continue to happen. Migration is a strategy that households really use to manage risk, to earn better, to meet their own aspirations. People move for marriage, people move for education, people move for a better life. But what climate change is doing is it's changing the conditions under which people are moving. And so when people move from, say, drought-hit or flood-prone areas, typically in rural spaces, and move to either other rural spaces or urban areas, some of these risks actually travel with them. And this is where the story becomes particularly difficult for certain people, where they move from one kind of risk into another. And then once they move into these spaces, often in large megacities in our country, they again are vulnerable to climate risks. So I'll talk about this and give you some ways of thinking about this connection between migration and climate change going forward. So this is this diagram comes from something that is called the Foresight Report. It was written by Richard Black, Neil Atker, and several other people in the UK and globally. It was a set of people who came together, and it's called the Foresight Report, which in 2011 they were tasked with the work of trying to make sense of how does environmental change and migration come together. And what they show, as you can see in the slide, if you just look at the Pentagon, that there are various reasons why people move. There are social drivers, things like requirements of education, moving because of family. There are political drivers where either persecution or a certain kind of conflict and these kinds of situations cause people to move. Demographic drivers, of course, changes in population structure, particular diseases emerging or falling, that can shape people's choices to move, and a range of economic drivers which fuel a lot of labor migration in India, changes in opportunity of employment, wage differentials between places, and so on. And one of these drivers is what we call environmental drivers. So changes in the resources that you are dependent on, say in a farming household, not being able to draw water for irrigation for your agriculture, and the changing nature of water availability can push some people out of farming as a sector and push them to move out. You can also have issues of habitability, where in certain countries actually, and in certain parts of India also, because of sea levels rising, land is actually, coastal land is just going into the sea. And that loss of land can push some people to move out. So a place is no longer habitable. You cannot live in a place. The place in some cases doesn't exist any longer, because of which you are forced to move out. So combination of all these factors is what the Foresight Report said, pushes people to make certain decisions. Often these decisions are taken at a household level. They can also be sometimes taken as an entire community, as an entire settlement or social group. And then people, based on various personal factors like levels of education, the kinds of assets they have, their preferences for a certain place, religion, language, age, sex, all of this, they can make decisions to choose to move or stay. So this is where the Foresight report led us for the first time, at least in the climate and migration, that intersection of climate change and migration, to place environmental drivers as a key part of this larger story of why people move and stay. To many migration researchers and people who work on migration, this will not be new, but it really placed this idea of environmental drivers as a significant pause for some kinds of people to move, and also said that there is an interaction. So migration is multi-causal, and often as climate change is occurring, this the environmental drivers, or the role that environmental drivers are playing, is only becoming more and more significant. So let's take the story now from this decision. A household on the right side of the slide takes a decision to stay or to move. In the climate change literature and the conversations around climate migration, this decision to move or stay has also been divided into further parts. So you've got people who autonomously move, they choose to move out of their own will. In some cases, there is planned movement of people because, say, there's a cyclone that's happened that has totally rendered a place uninhabitable, where you can't live at all. As I said, even the example of where you lose your land to the sea. And so the state, or someone from the outside, follows a planned process to shift you. That is often also called relocation, where people talk about post-disaster relocation. Now, autonomous movement, so the movement by own choice or by people themselves, can be of two kinds. One is labor migration, where people are moving. It can be of many forms. Things like seasonal movement, where people are periodically moving according to seasons. There can be permanent movement, where people leave a certain place and migrate to another. And there are various other forms, temporary, circular, where people move back and forth between places. Autonomous movement can also be in the form of displacement. So there's, of course, things like dams, of course, is development-induced displacement. But in climate migration, we talk of things like landslides displacing people, GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods. There was one a couple of years ago along the Teesta River in Sikkim, where a big glacier lake had an outburst. There was downstream floods, and large numbers of people had to move out of harm's way. So that kind of movement, which is called displacement. On the other side, planned movement, as I explained, is often done by the state. It is done by actors external to a community, where post rapid onset events like cyclones, which, unlike droughts, which are considered creeping events or slow onset events, rapid onset events like cyclones can sometimes push external actors to relocate people in a planned manner. Often this is also, sometimes it's done post-disaster, but it can also be done in a planned way. For example, in many small island countries in the Pacific Ocean, people are actually being relocated before the disaster happens. It's a form of preparing before disaster happens and reducing risk in that manner. But of course, planned relocation, as we all know, comes with its own challenges. People are deeply attached to the place they live in and often resist relocating away. So there is a story of sometimes pushback and resistance to this idea of planned relocation. People also, of course, choose to stay, even though there are a lot of examples from various parts of the world, but definitely from across South Asia, from places like the Sundarbans, even central India. You've got a lot of examples of where people choose to stay, despite there being droughts, there being salinization of water bodies, so where salt water is coming into your land, and still people choose to stay. Again, based on your agency, your ability to make a decision out of your own choice, there are two kinds of staying that happen. People who are unable to leave, so they want to leave but they're not able to. And these often, at least in the climate migration literature, we call them trapped populations. So they want to leave, but they're trapped in place, maybe because They don't have the networks, they don't have the assets to move, they don't know where to move, or there are political reasons because of which they can't move. This often happens in conflict situations. And then people who choose to stay. So despite it becoming risky, people choose to stay. And these people are called voluntary immobile. So this continuum of people moving and staying is called the mobility or immobility continuum in the climate migration literature. And it's often interesting to ask yourself, of these people who are moving and staying, who is doing it out of choice and who is having to do it because of some other reasons and compulsions? I always say that migration out of a choice is something that should be facilitated if it's done in a safe and dignified and resilient manner. If people are having to be forced to move, in the case of displacement, for example, or being forced to stay, in the case of trapped populations, for example, then obviously it is something that is not allowing people the freedom to live and work where they want to, in the way that it is enshrined in our constitution of our country. The IOM, the UN's body on international migration, talks about environmental and climate migration in these terms. I'm just giving you this definition because this is how it's spoken about globally. It is up to you to decide whether this definition holds for a country like ours. I'll read it out. The movement of a person or groups of persons who predominantly, for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment due to climate change, are obliged to leave their habitual place of residence or choose to do so temporarily or permanently within a state or across an international border. So they bring about this idea of either temporary or permanent movement. They bring about the idea of having to leave their habitual place of residence and it being done predominantly for reasons of environmental change because of climate change. So in principle, it's a broad enough definition, but it tends to, although it has this element of within a state, it tends to focus a lot on the IOM, and the framings of migration tend to focus a lot on international migrants. But what we know from a lot of research is that most movement actually, especially climate-induced movement, happens within country borders. And this alarmist narrative of millions and thousands of millions of people are going to be moving across country borders, typically from less developed countries to more developed countries, that is actually unfounded, and we don't have good evidence to prove that in literature. So now another question that regularly comes up is, does climate change really drive migration? So if you remember, we saw the Foresight report and that hexagon or pentagon where we said there are multiple drivers. But often policymakers are like, how many people are going to move because of climate change? And that's like $1 million question. There are various ways to do it, but lots of gaps in those ways, and there are lots of methodological questions still there about determining how many people are really going to move because of climate change. This is one interesting by Roman Hoffman and others from Vienna who've done this meta-analysis to sort of say that yes, there is evidence that actually climate variability and the extreme events because of climate change are showing some signals of movement. What they say is that but this relationship between climate change and migration is strongest in low and middle income countries such as India, which are dependent on agriculture, where a larger part of the population is dependent on agriculture. Then when we look at the work in India, what we also know is that, yes, when we look at rural to urban movement, there is quite a bit of evidence now generated to say that drought, floods, and irregular rains have direct impacts on agrarian livelihoods, so agriculture, livestock rearing, and that then sort of does push some people to move. But what is important to remember is that it is not that there is a drought and that leads to movement. There may be recurring droughts and they reach a tipping point which then leads people to move out. Also, of course, these are not linear systems. People make, as I said earlier, people make decisions to move and stay for a variety of reasons. And climate change or climate-induced extreme events are only one part of the story. So if ever you are going and trying to do a study of is climate change driving migration, ask yourself, if climate change wasn't there, what else would have driven this movement? So, and then sort of ask, has climate change changed something in this nature of movement? Also, it's important to remember that all climate change does not, as climate change is going, as weather and climate patterns are changing more and more, it doesn't mean that that will always lead to more migration. So it's not a simplistic relationship between the two. Because we know from the migration, decades and decades of work on migration, that the act of moving, whether within your country or outside your country, requires resources, it requires networks, and especially over large distances, you need the ability to, fund travel. You need the ability to have a place to stay where you're going to. You need networks to know where to get a job and so on. So it's not an easy choice that people or households make to move. Also, when you are in a particular place and a hazard has hit you, say drought, it has already depleted people's resources quite a bit. So it is not from a position of power that people are often moving, but actually the most vulnerable and the ones who are most hit by events, extreme events, actually are the last to move in a place. And that is what, as I said earlier, people often called trapped populations. And another thing I think to remember is that for some people, especially certain, and there's a lot of work that has been done studying coastal communities, some of the work that I have done myself in Tamil Nadu, Odisha and Kerala. When you are living along the coast, your livelihood's tied to fishing, your whole socio-cultural world is tied to being near and part of the sea. Ideas of place attachment, of staying and continuing to stay despite a place becoming risky is something that people deeply cherish. And actually in those kinds of places, people choose to remain immobile. They choose to stay back despite increasing risk. This is just a picture from one of my field visits in Tamil Nadu where Cyclone Gaja had wreaked havoc. Lots of people spoke very fondly about this stretch of the coast where people on this very place, this is the kind of sand deposition you see after large cyclones. This was a year after Cyclone Gaja, and you can see it's very difficult to remove these columns of sand which almost become like rock and take a lot of money and effort to remove. And this was the place where people hung out. This was a place where people played cricket in the evenings. And so there was this complete change in the way this village was operating even 1 year after this cyclone. And yet people chose to stay rather than go. So this idea of place attachment is something that we should not overlook when we are thinking about the movement of people in the context of climate change. I'll take one last example. This is from my own work in Karnataka. Some years ago, we were looking at how who is most affected by climate change in Bangalore city. Bangalore is a large metropolitan. Now around 13 million people live in the city. There are estimates that 1 in every 4 Bangaloreans is a migrant. So 1/4 of the city is built by migrants. The city itself is built by migrants like many of our mega cities. And we were curious to understand who is vulnerable to climate change. When we started looking at that, we did rounds and rounds of visits in various kinds of settlements and neighborhoods covering the whole city, and we found that time and again it was low-income migrants who came up as the most vulnerable. They were the people who were affected by water scarcity and an inability to buy water during urban droughts. They were the people who were facing the brunt of localized flooding in the city. They were the people who were also repeatedly reporting being affected by drought where they were coming from. So the two other places that you see marked on the map, Gulbarga, which is now Kalaburgi in North Karnataka, and Kolar, which is in South Karnataka. Both of these also, these were main districts which are sending migrants into Bangalore city. So what we did is we went around these two districts to look at short-term commuting from Kolar to Bangalore. It's 100 kilometers away and people take trains and buses every day to come and go. And then also looking at seasonal and more permanent migration from Gulbarga to Bangalore. And this was a paper we wrote where we really started, We used a lot of in-depth life history interviewing methods, so traveling with people as they travel between these regions to Bangalore city to understand how do they negotiate changing climate risk. This paper was called Moving in and Out of Vulnerability, and we were looking at this rural-urban continuum. And what we really, two big things we said from this. One is that a lot of people have spoken about migration as a way for people to move out of certain risky situations. In this case, drought and water scarcity in a place like Gulbarga in North Karnataka, where you've got rain-fed farming and very climate-sensitive livelihoods, such as smallholder farming, pastoralism, livestock rearing, and so on. So you've got a story of people moving out of risk. And this is well established. Households for centuries actually have been using migration as a way to spread risk. You don't only stay in one risky place, you spread it, you seasonally move, and you come back when the farming system is able to, has work and is able to provide a livelihood. But the other side of the story was that when people do move, they tend to move into other risky situations. These are some of the informal settlements that migrants from Gulbarga were residing in North Bangalore. Migrants often move into informal settlements where they have new types of risks, poor access to water and other services like electricity, sanitation services, inadequate health and education access, and very, very precarious informal livelihoods. There's also, of course, a lot of criminalization of migrants, othering of them when they come into cities. And what was most, it's something that is common sense and yet overlooked, is that when you are moving from a place like Gulbarga to Bangalore, the nature of hazard that you are exposed to is also changing. You are moving from a drought-prone area where water scarcity and less water was the problem to a flood-prone city where excess water and a higher rainfall is the new problem. And so many of these migrants we spoke to did not even have any kind of mental model of dealing with too much water or the risks of infectious diseases that come with waterlogging in your house or near your house. So when you are moving from one type of risk to another, you are completely also having to move your whole system of managing risk, which is what we call adaptation. You have to adapt to a whole new set of problems. And that is where migrants were really falling through the cracks. Of course, there are other issues of migrants being completely ignored, at least at that time in Bangalore's story or understanding of climate action, who do we need to reduce risk for, and so on and so forth, which has now, of course, changed. The other big thing that we found from the study was that in this moving in and out, so the moving in and out of risk is happening between source and destination areas, but it's also happening between household members within the household. So we found that migration outcomes, I'm not going to go into these graphs, these are just illustrative pictures really to show that men and women within the same household actually face different types of risk, and migration leads to different outcomes for men and women very differently within the same household that's moving or staying. So we found that first of all, migration outcomes are dynamic and they're mixed within a household. It can be upward, downward, or people just staying in place. We found that rarely was migration actually leading to upward socio-economic mobility. That means they weren't doing better because of migrating. If you look at just income, yes, they were doing much better. But if you look at various other things, which we call subjective well-being, so your idea of happiness, your idea of better quality of life, lots of women respondents repeatedly spoke to me about not being able to have time for leisure, time for friendships, ability to move safely in a city. So a lot of, on one side, you've got the story of migration giving you money, better money, leading to higher material well-being. But on the other side, you've got the story of a reduction in their quality of life or subjective well-being. And that is why this work led us to sort of argue that, first of all, you need to think about supporting migrants and climate migrants in both source and destination areas. You need to think about this whole rural-urban continuum as connected. And you also need to think about how changing risk between these spaces also needs changing strategies to manage that risk. So I'll end with a short summary and then some takeaways for you all. First, that as I said in the beginning, migration is multi-causal. We know that, but climate change is a threat multiplier. So it multiplies whatever existing threats there are because of the nature of exacerbating, increasing the kind of situation of risk that you are. Second, the ability for people to move is socially differentiated. By that I mean that based on your caste, your age, your gender, access to resources, your network, social networks, assets, your abilities to move are different. And while what we find from a lot of data, my own studies, but also a lot of work across India, is that migration does actually help people manage risk. So migration in some ways can be an adaptation strategy, but it is not for everyone. And the poorest, the one in most precarious informal work, the ones who are living in very hazard-prone, say flood-prone areas in a city, they are not able to treat migration as an adaptation strategy. They are barely coping. They're just managing to make ends meet, but they are not able to prosper through migration. And what I want to also leave you with is that while a lot of studies say that is migration an adaptation strategy? Is migration a positive thing? We can test that through remittances. What we have shown with these life history interviews is that remittances are incomplete in telling the full story of how climate migrants are doing. And that is why we need to track changes in people's well-being, both material and subjective, so your quality of life, how people are adapting. So do you have the capacity to adapt to new risks, or are you just able to deal with drought and then when you come across a flood, you are completely pushed down? And track changes in precarity. So people's insecurities, vulnerabilities that they enter once they move. So it is, if one is to really say, is migration helping or hindering people to deal with climate risks? These are the questions you have to ask. Is it helping reduce precarity? Is it helping improve well-being? And is it helping improve people's capacities to adapt? So finally, to conclude, I want to just share with you this particular report we recently launched, which is about thinking about now the policy landscape. So you've got, I have spoken enough about the gaps and the problems in what we know, but where does Indian policy really bring climate change and migration together? And what we found is that there are several policies, but many migration policies are climate blind. That means that our migrant policies don't think about how climate change is impacting migrants, and vice versa. Our climate policies often are migrant exclusive. They completely miss identifying, acknowledging the role of how migrants are dealing with climate risks, and they don't also then do anything about solutions for migrants. So in conclusion, South Asia, as I said, and India in particular, is at the forefront of climate risk, but it's also urbanizing. There is a big and clear story of increasing climate variability. What that means is that there are more frequent and more intense extreme events like droughts, floods, heat waves. Many people are also now aspiring to move away from farming. And there is uneven development between states or even within states, which is leading to migration, both towards cities but also rural areas. So these, as I said earlier, climate migration is multi-causal. Climate change is increasingly an important factor. A lot of this movement, of course, is in the informal sector, where precarious living and working conditions are leading to very different outcomes for different genders, for different people. And that is why migration is often, like the outcomes of migration are mixed, and they are not always positive for everyone. And unfortunately, migrants are somewhat absent in current development policy as well as climate policy. And that, I feel, is the next steps for people who are interested in this kind of topic to think about what are the sets of solutions that can help us simultaneously deal with the issue of climate change, but also help labor migrants, low-income migrants, be part of that solution rather than only people who are vulnerable. If you want to read more about this work, there's a project that we are doing called Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways. This is the website. And thank you so much.
Right. Thanks so much, Chandni, for, in one class you managed to take us through the main concepts in migration and climate change, and also, your empirical work, which is so rich. So thanks for sharing that with us. And I think one of the main takeaways for us is, how is it that empirics can intersect with policy, right? Because a lot of the work that you're doing is literally at the intersection of empirics and policy. So that's also, I think, it's very useful, because we mostly studied theories in the course, and there's one section which is devoted to policy. So that's really kind of very helpful. So in such a context, I'll just ask one question, and we've had such a rich talk by you in terms of policies, and and when we say policies around climate change, it also has to do with evidence, right? We have all of this really hard evidence around climate change and of course migration. But what if there's policy denial, right? When there's policy denial both of climate change and migration, then there's sort of, and it sort of doubly intersects. What can be some practical ways of working around that? Could you share your thoughts around that?
Yeah, thanks so much. Absolutely. I think we must appreciate that both of these are extremely complex phenomenon and highly politicized. So migration itself is a tough thing. Many people frame it as a failure of development of places that are losing people, which I think is not completely true, because migration also fuels a lot of development. So on that side, there are lots of complexities. Our numbers are outdated in some places, and that's where the empirics comes into play, where different sets of people are trying to fill that gap in numbers. And on the other side, you've got another extremely complex, politicized phenomenon, which is climate change. Who should do what? India as a country has not emitted as much. So is this our time to grow and develop, or is this the time that we now have to start, reducing our emissions? So I can understand the challenges in policy making separately for these two things. And then when you bring them together, it becomes even more challenging. So it is not surprising to me, actually, that somehow in the climate policies, migrants have fallen behind. They're completely absent in several of them. We did a review of 94 policies in different states and then at the national level, and found, I think, around only 4 or 5 of them actually explicitly talk about migrants. They talk about livelihoods in general, and particular livelihoods being vulnerable, but not identifying migrants, low-income migrants, as a category. So first step, I would say, is recognition. Just to reorient the balance, first recognizing that, of course, all migrants are not the same, but there are certain types of migrants who are repeatedly falling through the cracks. So in climate policy, can we recognize low-income migrants as vulnerable? Second, then, of course, is recognition is not enough, as we know. And then what are the strategies, pathways where we can sort of either mainstream migration in climate policy or climate change in migration policy? So if you're thinking about something that has been for a long time, like Interstate Workmen's Act, right, that has been there since the 1970s. If we had to think of a similar policy or update that kind of an act, what would it mean for it to be climate proof? If there are, like the Building and Construction Workers Act, again, which has some provisions for the kinds of benefits migrants get, can there be some provisions for more ventilation in housing, which we know that there are certain corridors, migrant corridors, that are facing extreme heat. So even on the social protection side, can we climate proof social protection? So actually in our work, what we've been saying is that adaptive social protection. So this idea that your social protection should be climate proofed. It should be thinking of being adaptive. So there's that recognition element. There's the element of actually just trying to mainstream both these things in each other's policies. And then finally, most importantly, I think there's a lot of talk about these things. Can we do some pilot tests? And I think these testing of solutions have to happen at very local level. Like there's some interesting work that CMID, the Center for Migration and Inclusive Development in Kochi, are looking at mobile health clinics as a way to sort of, they call them Bandhu clinics, looking at how mobile health clinics can reach migrants. Now it was designed as a health intervention, But through that work, they have been understanding that there are seasons to the kind of infectious diseases you see, and those seasons are changing because of climate change. So rain patterns are changing, so your dengue, malaria incidence is changing. That's valuable data to then sort of design interventions that can be both for migrants, of course targeting migrants, but also keeping this climate risk, changing risk in mind. So that's one thing that comes to mind. So I think that, and this has come from doing, like you trial something, it doesn't work, it works. And actually WHO has picked up that work as an exemplar of, thinking about climate change and health for migrants. I think it's the only case from India that's been picked up. So these are some of things one can think of. It's also having more conversations like these, I think, where there are different communities of people coming together and talking about these complex issues.
Right. Right. Thanks so much. We've unfortunately come to the end. We've exceeded our time, but what has been a very, very useful, lucid and informative talk for our course, and we're very grateful to you, and thanks for taking the time out to do this. So that was a very, very rich talk by Dr. Chandni Singh on climate change and migration, and broadly this is an area which is coming up a lot in research, in policy, and Dr. Singh took us through her work on climate change and migration, her empirical work that intersects with policy. So I'm sure that was very useful for people who are thinking about projects on migration, for people who wanted to a class on climate change. We were able to cover that, and also the overall concepts of climate migration. So I think with that note, we come to the end of this section, and we will meet soon. Thank you.